We have been here before, but how important is this current talk of a Labour-Lib Dem pact ahead of the next general election? Discussing it now?
You're right, we have been here before. Maybe we'll come to that in a moment. I think the first thing to say, to some degree, what is being said about what Labour and the Democrats are minded to do at the next general election isn't really a great deal more than a statement of the obvious. The honest truth is that these days, political parties don't simply campaign here, there and everywhere. They have long been focusing their efforts on the marginal seats, i.e. the seats that they think they've got the best chance of winning. And it so happens to be the case that there is virtually nowhere in the United Kingdom where the seat is currently held by the Conservatives and where Labour and the Democrats are as well placed as each other to be an effective challenger. Indeed, there are only a couple of constituencies, one in Sheffield, the other in Cambridge, where Labour and the Democrats are likely to be fighting it out at the next election with the possibility of a seat changing hands. So if all that simply Labour and the Democrats do is to focus their resources on the seats where they've got the best chance, then indeed the Democrats will be primarily focusing on relatively marginal Conservative seats where the Liberal Democrats are second, much of which is in the south of England, particularly in and around the capital. Labour, in contrast, will be focusing its resources on its marginal seats in the Midlands and the north of England. And that, in a sense, is a statement of the obvious. Now, that said, I guess where it's so far gone a little bit further than we might have anticipated was in the couple of by-elections that were held before Christmas. The Liberal Democrats certainly didn't try very hard in Old Bexley and Sidcup, gave Labour something of a close run, though Labour weren't able to win the seat. Perhaps that in itself not that surprising. Well, the more surprising was Labour not trying in North Shropshire, even though they were starting off in second place, giving the Liberal Democrats a free run, and that was an opportunity for the Liberal Democrat seats. But let's not exaggerate what's going on here. We're not talking about Labour not fighting everywhere. We're not talking about the Liberal Democrats not fighting everywhere. We're just simply talking about the parties focusing their resources on the seats they've got the best chance of winning, and that simply means that de facto they'll be fighting the Conservatives in different places.
On policy, though, it's a very different Labour to Corbyn's Labour that will be fighting that election, and Starmer is clearly trying to fundamentally reinvent the party. Does the left-wing sniping matter, or can he just shrug that off?
I don't think it matters very much at the moment because, in truth, actually, in contrast to the politics of the 1990s, when Tony Blair was helping to move his party further to the right beyond what already Neil Kinnock had done, there isn't at the moment any obvious challenge from the left. I mean, back in Tony Blair's era, some parties, including George Galloway, who's going to be interviewing later on, then with the Respect Party, were able to take some votes off Labour. And of course, at that stage, the Liberal Democrats were actually rather keener on tax increases than Labour. Labour were very reluctant to say taxes were going to go up. Liberal Democrats were willing to say that they should. Now, at the moment, at least, the Democrats are not adopting that position, and we don't have any strong challenge from the left. So I think, in truth, so far as moving his party towards the centre is concerned, Sir Keir Starmer has rather more room for manoeuvre. But of course, the fact that there is this debate going on inside the Conservatives probably, I think, also makes Sir Keir's life rather easier. What Labour above all want to do is not so much move politics back from left towards the centre as to shift politics away from Brexit and the culture wars and the arguments about those issues back on, indeed, to the arguments about how big should the state be post-pandemic. Should we be running such a large, heavily taxed economy or not? Labour's problem hitherto is that facing a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson, who is rather interventionist by Conservative standards, arguably face them with a difficult target. If indeed the Conservatives, either under Boris Johnson or under a successor, themselves tapped rather more to the right, then there will be much more space for Labour to be able to say, well, look, actually, if you wish to preserve the kind of big government that protected the economy during the COVID crisis, then you need to vote for us, not the Conservatives. So I think, in truth, what's going on now inside the Conservatives is also relevant to Sir Keir Starmer's opportunities.
Totally agree. And a very quick final thought on it. There's also the issue of freedom of citizens, and what's going on in Canada is causing an absolute furore, and people are openly and widely debating it. David Frost includes in his Telegraph article a big chunk on the rights and freedoms of the individual. That's the legacy of COVID as much as anything, and that will be front and centre.
Well, it's certainly an area where we're having quite a lot of debate. I've got a report coming out on Monday. One of the things it shows is that we are indeed, as a society, willing now to question authority to an increasing extent, and that continued during the pandemic, and that was reflected in the debates about the COVID restrictions. Of course, notice that on this issue, the Labour Party at the moment are not saying that, the anticipated announcement on Monday that we're going to get rid of most of the COVID restrictions, in England at least, is necessarily wrong. They're at the moment holding their fire. Though, of course, what is true, I think the Labour Party in Wales will be still going for a more conservative strategy. I suspect Labour, frankly, will wait to see what happens. If the unwrapping of the regulations goes pear-shaped and COVID takes off again, Labour will be ready to criticise. I suspect that on Monday, however, they'll be relatively quiet.
All right, John, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for those insights on Labour, the left and the Conservatives and freedom. Always good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. John Curtis, Professor of Politics there at Strathclyde. Joining me now, I'm delighted to say, is Lloyd Russell Moyle, Labour Member of Parliament for Brighton Kemp Town. Great to see you. Thank you for finding time for us this Saturday afternoon. Do you agree with the central argument that Galloway makes, which people will be hearing a bit later on, when he says that in his view the United Kingdom will never vote for full-blooded socialism?
Well, I don't think the United Kingdom would ever vote for a full-blooded version of any ideological diktat. And I don't think it ever has. I don't think it's ever voted for complete free market capitalism where there is no state regulation. And I suspect it wouldn't necessarily want no market-driven forces at all. It is about getting the right balance, and it is about where we lie that balance. And
okay, but let me butt in at that point because no, I've got that point, because that's in fact what John Curtis was just saying as well. Is as the Tories begin to beat themselves up about how far they want to go on free markets, it does open centre ground for you. Are you, as a left-wing member of Parliament, happy with the direction that Sir Keir is taking your party in?
Well, I think the proof will be in the pudding and in the tasting of it. And so let's see what comes out in the elections. If we are talking about packaging our policies in a way that people understand better, then I'm all for that.
Are you content with this talk so early out and actually Brighton's not a bad example because you've got the only one Green MP down there just along the way from you, of Labour and the Liberal Democrats sitting down and saying, look, we're not going to win that one. We might win Sheffield if you stand back, this, that and the other, as Curtis just explained. Are you happy with that as a point of principle?
As a point of principle, I mean, when I first won my election, the Greens stood down for me in my seat. And the Liberals stood down for the Greens in Caroline's seat, and that's how I got elected. So on principle, I've got nothing wrong with that. I think that it needs to be done by each local party and each individual party if there's going to be something more than just resource allocation. If it's just resource allocation, to tell you the truth, that's what we've always done. You know, I was a candidate in Lewis constituency many years ago, and that is a Liberal Conservative. We didn't put so many resources into that. We put all of our resources, even from the local constituency next door in my constituency that I am now elected in, because we understood we had to put our resources where we were likely to win. So that's always happened.
Finally, that point that John Curtis and I were also talking about at the very end of our conversation, post-COVID and given what's happening in Canada right now, there seems to be a far greater appetite to talk about personal freedoms, individual freedoms and the role of the state. Are you up for that, or do you think that's dangerous territory for the modern Labour Party?
Well, I'm unusual in the left of the Labour Party because I come from a kind of radical liberal tradition in Sussex, kind of Bonfire and Thomas Paine and things like this. So I do think that is interesting discussions. Actually, however, sit on the doorstep. Most people are talking about the cost of living, talking about the fact that they can't afford their fuel bills. On a theoretical point, I do think the Labour Party needs to be better at not just being big statist, but understands that we need to empower each individual. That's why I support things like a universal basic income and universal basic services, not that are means tested, but that empower people to choose what they want to spend their money on, and everyone gets a basic. It's a socialist approach that gives people freedom. I'm not sure that we're in the same place as they are in Canada, though, as well. I think we be careful sometimes when we conflate Atlantic politics to British politics.